Hello, I'm Michael Strong, founder of the Adolescent Flourishing Institute, and we are an entity that is focused on the ways in which educational freedom, educational choice can improve adolescent flourishing. I came to this because I've been in education for 35 years, focused on small schools improve adolescent flourishing by means of community, connection, meaning, and purpose. I've discovered over decades that often children who are anxious, depressed, suicidal come to school where they receive more connection, community, meaning, and purpose. Adults care about them, the peers are positive, and as a consequence, within weeks or months, they are no longer anxious, depressed, no longer taking medication. In many cases, they are happy, well, flourishing. And I realized that in the conversation about adolescent flourishing in the United States, no one is focused on the role of schools, learning environments, educational institutions. So the Adolescent Flourishing Institute is dedicated to doing research and examining the different ways in which different kinds of learning environments, homeschooling, microschooling, learning pods, Catholic schools, religious schools, private schools, public schools, small schools, big schools, might impact the well-being of adolescents. Personally, I believe that we will see an immense impact because I've seen dramatic differences in how different young people respond to different learning environments. So I'm delighted to be partnering with the Cosmos Institute this evening. We share an interest in the role of AI and flourishing. One dystopian version of the world is that AI slop, AI addictive technology will continue to degrade human nature. Jin Twenge and Jonathan Haidt have made reputations for showing the role of social media and smartphones in terms of increased anxiety, depression, suicide. One way to think about a world of AI is this could be a world on steroids. Not just young people, but all of us are going to become more addicted to more garbage, not to put too fine a point on it. On the other hand, there could be a positive vision for AI. I'm personally working on a project of how to help AI develop purpose in young people, aligned with my educational approach. I know the Cosmos Institute with Brendan McCord is interested in virtue and AI and how we can use AI to help people live more fulfilling lives. So I look forward to having an informed conversation, myself primarily as an educator. Brendan is a successful AI entrepreneur with several exits who is now focused on AI and flourishing. I'm focused on education and flourishing. We're both interested in these AI and flourishing projects. So we'll get into the weeds of both the nightmarish version as well as a positive version and how we can each individually and then as organizations move towards a more positive version. We're delighted that Integrally One, led by Steve Everist, is sponsoring this evening. Steve Everist's project is to develop rational civil dialogue based on intellectual integrity online. I've used his product. He is working on really how to take care of the pathology of metrics on social media. Right now, social media rewards outrage and sensationalism. That's why we get so much garbage on social media. Steve Everest, Integrally One, is designed to reward thoughtful intellectual dialogue. And as an educator, this is key to what I do at the Socratic Experience, my virtual school. And I know that Brendan at Cosmos is also interested in AI and intellectual integrity. So Steve is kind of at the frontier of combining these interests, and it's entirely appropriate that he is sponsoring this evening with myself at Adolescent Flourishing Institute and Brendan McCord at the Cosmos Institute.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brendan McCord. I'm the founder and chair of Cosmos. We are the Academy for Philosopher Builders, and our mission is to develop a new kind of technologist, one that draws from the inspiration of Benjamin Franklin and starts with philosophical ideas, but has the ability to translate those into practical innovation in a way that promotes human flourishing. We're set up as two entities with one mission. Cosmos Holdings does the training of this philosopher builder, and Cosmos Holdings equips them to build companies that change the world. Tonight, I'm excited to talk about adolescent flourishing. I'm excited to talk about how the children of the AI revolution, people like my son and daughter who are 4 and 6, how they enter this world, what kinds of habits of mind and forms of moral development that they need to pick up to thrive in the AI age. And I'm excited to do it with a mentor of mine, Michael Strong. This is the first time I've done this with Michael, but the story of Cosmos Institute is really wrapped up in our relationship, I would say, actually. So 4 years ago, I sold 2 AI companies, and it was great timing. It was a really wonderful outcome. I also had the second of my 2 children. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and both those things happening at once made me reflect more deeply than I ever had on a few questions. One was what I want to do with the rest of my life, professionally especially. 2 was what did I want to model for those little humans? And then as a consequence of that, I needed to think about what I believed in. And so I embarked on this perennial quest to try to figure out those questions, what it means to live well. I started with philosophy, and I think that was a good instinct, but I didn't know how to get going. And I met Michael at a dinner that Luke and Nicole had hosted, actually. And I heard you speak about, maybe it was Gary Becker, you said something about predation. And I was just like, this person is really very, very thoughtful person. And I said, can we get lunch? We got lunch, we talked about it, and Michael realized that I was authentic, that I was really trying to kind of embark on this quest, that it wasn't just performative. I really wanted to try to delve into these questions in a way I never had. And so he gave me the gift of a lifetime. It was a 17-page annotated reading list that described kind of the rabbit holes one might go down in this quest. Like a lifetime of doing that gave some pretty good advice on how one might pursue it. And it started with the ancients who thought really deeply and genuinely about these questions. It moved to the early Enlightenment, the American founding, modern debates in political economy. Long story short, it changed my life. It transformed me. It made me more interesting to myself. It set the trajectory for all that would come. And 15 minutes a day became like 3 or 4 hours a day of reading this. So I'm an AI entrepreneur. That's kind of, I identify mostly as an entrepreneur, not as a philosopher, although I hold it in the highest esteem. But Cosmos Institute is what emerged from that. And I can talk more about it, but we're trying to develop a new kind of technologist, one for our moment, one we call the philosopher builder. And it's somebody who really integrates deep reflection on the big questions, on the human goods, on how technology in particular can promote human flourishing. They combine that with the skill to build at the highest level. And somebody we look to as inspiration is Benjamin Franklin, who thought about the Enlightenment project and then built the first lending library in the New World, built the system of publishers. So this kind of ability to translate across, that's what we stand for. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Brendan. And, I'm very much a philosopher, a humanist, an educator, and I'm delighted that we've got a world-class AI entrepreneur who is connecting the world of philosophy. And Brendan is leading the philosophy and AI initiative, I would say, globally. So those of us who care about the human condition and might be a little bit concerned about AI and where it's going, and maybe later we'll talk about AI slop and all sorts of things. It's great to kind of have this intersection between these two universes. Just quickly on the adolescent flourishing, and then I'll get into virtue and philosophy a little bit. So, it's many people are aware that Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt have shown that there's been an increase in anxiety, depression, and suicide, especially among girls, especially in Anglo-American countries since the rise of smartphones. And it's pretty shocking and horrifying if you look at the graphs. At the same time, while I do not doubt that social media and smartphones are part of the problem, I think there are deeper issues. And so I think one of the legitimate concerns with AI is, oh no, now we're going to get the problem of social media and smartphones, exponentially worse. And I think that is true, and which is why we've got to solve that problem tonight. But separately, while teen suicides have been maybe up 30 to 50% in the last 10 to 15 years, and that's a horrible thing. What people don't realize is that teen suicides are up 300% since the 1950s. And so personally, as somebody who cares deeply about virtue, and today at lunch I was asking Brendan if he was a Platonist or an Aristotelian, we go into the foundations of virtue, and you need to have a purpose in life. You need to have a direction in life. You need to be embedded in a moral community. You need to be in a tradition that cares about who you are and what you stand for. And I think prior to modernity in the 20th century, most people around the world, different cultures have different norms and so forth, but at least people were embedded. What we saw in the 20th century is pulling away from any kind of embeddedness in a virtue culture towards, this enemy and disconnectedness. And I see AI, well, first, smartphones and social media just, adding fuel to that fire. So to connect this with education, I've been in education as an educational entrepreneur for 30 some years, and I've seen over decades hundreds of kids who are anxious, depressed, and suicidal in one environment become happy and well in a different environment. And I'm not saying that I personally create magic, and I know lots of other people who create schools where there is more connection, community, meaning, and purpose, see similar transformations. But I think people are not paying attention to the extent to which there's this underlying cultural thing related to enemy, meaningless, disconnection, where perhaps schools are part of that solution. So the Adolescent Flourishing Initiative is designed to support research on how different schools and different school cultures and different forms of education might result in different outcomes in terms of human flourishing. And because AI, again, is putting fuel to the fire, I think it's timely to look at, now that we're at this inflection point where as bad as things are, they might get much, much worse, how to perhaps flip that around. So maybe I'll start by asking, and we'll involve the audience. We'll get Brendan and I going, and then we'll involve all of you. But I ask you, how seriously or how concerned are you about kind of the nightmare scenarios in terms of not AI doomers, but very specifically the moral impact of AI on young people and others? Is this a concern? How much of a concern? What are you thinking about that?
I think the way that I'm thinking about it is that a certain kind of context of usage, a certain kind of culture, a certain kind of habit formation will lead to it being one of the most exciting times to be a kid, right? I think like for my kids, I feel that way. Mm-hmm. We can talk about like how we've thought about that together. But I do think that the temptation toward passivity and dependence among children is as high as it's ever been. The temptation for passivity and dependence among adults is as high as it's ever been. I think of AI as being an autocomplete for life in the worst case, where the micro abdication of judgment, when we sort of like abdicate the very small things, then, it completes not just the work, like the autocomplete of old, but completes the decision, completes the kind of like, the next relationship, the next identity, that sort of thing. That adds up. And we become progressively enfeebled in one really important way, which is human autonomy, or this is to say, our cultivated capacity to self-direct. So I think that is set early on among children, and a child who grows up externalizing deliberation, which in some sense is what a child exists to do. I mean, childhood, I think, is a normative condition in which we're trying to build a unified will, an integrated will, right? We don't have that, but that's one of the goals of education. And so if during this critical phase of building the will, becoming an autonomous, being able to oversee one's self, if in that stage we are actually deferring, offloading, and not forming it, then we essentially never leave childhood.
So much there. First, for me, I want to emphasize that I see all these problems as continuous, as very old problems. Just going way back, I always say the best thing about my own education is I grew up in northern Minnesota with bad TV reception, so I became a reader. I would perhaps have been more addicted to TV, and this is merely TV with 3 channels in the 70s. And so the addictive nature is a danger. And then the other thing is, maybe 20 years ago, I went to a talk by a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and he was talking then about be careful when you check email. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Be careful when you check email. Then I realized even checking email, you might get this adrenaline bump, depending on what's in your inbox. And so I've become much more intentional about, digital hygiene, even before all of this happened. But going back to, those of us who can be intentional about it, whether at the home or in schools, super important. What about the people who don't have the home life of your children and or schools? Is there anything to be done out there in the wild?
Well, one thing I want to ask you on this is, while it may be continuous, like there's this question of whether we're offloading something that is somehow more vital, more central to flourishing. So, like, you've read Phaedrus, 380 BC, Plato is saying that writing can harm our memory. And, he's raising a few other critiques for writing. But we clearly do that, and we've made it, through. We offload to calculators, to Google Maps, to other things. So the question here for me is like whether offloading deliberation is different, like offloading phronesis, to use Aristotle's terms. And I think yes. Like I think there's something more central to the capacity for self-direction, to like deciding on ends, than there is navigation. Like I would cede my spatial, my part of my neocortex that handles spatial stuff to the London cab driver. I would say I'm nowhere near them. But when it comes to this self-direction, I worry about that. The other thing I think is interesting is if we are creatures of habit, again, kind of drawing on the original Aristotelian insight, then simply the ability to cradle our decision-making with very personalized, pervasive, and constant opportunity for offloading may be a difference in degree that is in fact a difference in kind. So I would say that, and I'd love your reaction to it, but yeah, go ahead, actually.
A really interesting question. So first, I do think, I read about the Greeks. Plato was concerned, or Socrates was concerned about writing would reduce their memory. And people used to be able to listen to a 6-hour talk and go replicate the 6-hour talk. Or listen, to the Iliad and repeat the Iliad. So people had what we would regard as extraordinary feats of memory before writing destroyed that part of us. And even calculation, I think I am dependent on calculators. I'm embarrassed by what I'll go to a calculator for. When I was a teenager, I would have done that in my head, no problem. So I think there is kind of a trade-off thing. That said, before going to the judgment and ends thing, that's super important. I would say that I find Google gives me superpowers, and part of it is because I know a lot of things, and Google is becoming garbage, by the way, but Google 20 years ago, because I know so many things, it allowed me to search more effectively for things. So just as, if you have a fairly sophisticated mental apparatus, then you can use technology to, have superpowers. And I think AI will be that for many people who do have intentionality and a well-developed mental map and so forth. And so then the question is it damaging in new and different ways? And is that a matter of degree or a matter of kind? And I guess one thing, just to be on the not entirely negative thing, is I think of very traditional cultures as not giving people an option of, their ends. A medieval person would be born, your dad was a tailor, you were born a tailor, your son will be a tailor. So maybe there was this brief period during the Enlightenment when we became independent thinkers. Initially it was 0.001%, and then maybe in the 20th century it became 10%. I don't know. We could be mean, but I don't know that there's ever been a period where everybody was an independent thinker or set their own means. And then the question is, will the incredible freedom of access to information that AI has put in on steroids, I think with a certain foundation, it will liberate more people more effectively. But then the question is, are there other people, again, lack this either in the household and or in the schools, who are enslaved ever more effectively? So maybe there's kind of a bifurcation where,
I think that's right. The other thing is, so this is going to sound name droppy, and I apologize, but Peter Attia lives in Austin, and Peter Attia is a big health guy. But I was talking with him about this question, and I raised the quote from Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician. You know the quote. It's the measure of civilization's advance is the number of important operations of thought we can perform without thinking about them. So what he's saying is that, in fact, this is really important, that we can offload thought, and specifically deliberation. Like when we approach the traffic light, we're not really thinking about the kind of mechanic, we're just sort of following it. When we brush our teeth in the morning, we're not thinking about dental health. Like it's just autonomic. And he gave the example of Max Verstappen, the Formula One driver, being able to talk in a very leisurely way while he's flinging himself around the track, because he's done it so many times in the rain, because his dad had him do it, you know? And so, more than making us great race car drivers, this builds the edifice of civilization. It's like, we only have so much glucose to go around. Computation is really costly for us as humans. And so for first principles reasoners, you know, it doesn't work. Like, we have to save our cavalry charges. Okay. But on the other hand, it's super clear that there have been cases where people outsource moral questions and they become evil. Like the staff in the concentration camp had, in no small way, outsourced a very important question. And maybe they did it bit by bit, but they did. We do this to political parties, we do it all the time. So this strikes me, you mentioned bifurcating, this strikes me as kind of like the key question is, which parts of this are salutary and like civilization dependent, and which parts of this can lead to like enfeeblement, totalitarian takeover, great evil. And I would argue that nobody's really thought about this.
Yeah, no, again, that's why philosophy and AI is a super important topic. I think of the Socratic quest as the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, or the noble. You don't know, or I don't know, I don't think anybody knows exactly what it is, but we want to be in constant inquiry for that. And it's important that inquiry be in community. That is, I think anybody who sits down and thinks, I've got the answer, I'm going to write Mein Kampf and tell everybody the answer. Again, to just take that stereotype. But again, Steve, going back to integrally, where Steve is engaged in, I would say, a ethical argumentation and taking the other side seriously. John Stuart Mill, what is the strongest argument on the other side? So with respect to ends, I'm all for outsourcing lots of things. We want to be focused on what matters. And I think what matters is the true, the good, and the noble over a lifetime in a broad community. And then how do we set up so that more people are more likely to do it over a lifetime in inquiry, with community, with healthy dialogic norms. So there's kind of a framework there where you can kind of see all the pieces we have to do either within AI and or with our human institutions that intersect with AI, so we have fewer kind of going down the limited rabbit holes.
Can I raise a couple of tough questions that I'm thinking about? So I'll raise the first one, but I'll try to so one thought here is that I was just thinking a lot about AI and science. And let's imagine for a second that AI becomes really, really good at doing science, really, really good at thinking about things, and let's like have awareness that when we each use the microwave, I mean, we may have some smart physicists in this room, but we kind of don't know how it works, right? We have functional understanding. We don't have a mechanistic understanding. We don't have a deep understanding of it. We just kind of take it on, it kind of works, right? A lot of science that we know as humans, we don't like individually know. So we have to kind of realize that even though Mill wants us to have vital force, right, for ideas, he wants us to both tie them down and to have them have force in our lives. It's not the case with a lot of what we have around us. Okay, so now imagine that AI has incredible capacity to create new knowledge that's valuable stuff. Do we just kind of accept that as crumbs falling off the table and catch them and use them for our own nourishment? How do we sort of how do we share that epistemic authority? If we have AI systems that can do things, do we just sort of blindly trust those things?
So obviously there are hard questions, and in some cases, as you say, we already blindly trust a lot. But I think the core question is, how do I live my life? And what is my life about? And one thing, Robert Heinlein in the 1970s wrote a book about brain transplants, and there are brain transplants on dogs right now. And we could have brain transplants. You could have your brain transplanted into another body. For me, no matter where the technology goes, the question is, do I want to die, or do I want to let my brain And so that, I think you're the leading expert in the world on you. I'm the world's leading expert on me. Each of us, our individuality is inextricably us. And so whatever we outsource to technicians, whether it be human technicians or AI or whatever, there's still going to be questions about, do I want to have a child? Do I want to have another child? Do I, all these things. And so I think tech does best what human does best, and human beings will always have to make decisions about what does it mean for me to be a human.
My next question, and we can kind of talk about the young kids, but my next question is, you mentioned Google and how it kind of extends you. And one thing I've been thinking about is, like, in the movie Memento, the main character has a big memory, as she may have seen it, and he uses Post-it notes, tattoos, things like that. And they're really a part of his cognition, right? They're really a part of his thinking. They're more than just how you or I would use Post-it notes.
Right.
Okay? And it does seem like certain tools under certain conditions form part of the extended mind. It's Clark and Chalmers,
right.
Famously write about this.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether AI is inevitably one of those tools where it becomes essentially part of our cognitive apparatus. And if this is true, how is it that we don't get lost in it? How is it that we don't find ourselves in kind of an invisible waltz where we don't know, which part of it is me and which part of it is the pull of algorithmic suggestion?
Good question again. And one version is I don't know, but again, I find, just like I can't remember a 6-hour speech, I depend on both Google and my email inbox to remember all kinds of things. I might have this vague recollection. Let's look in my inbox, and see what this person said 3 years ago or whatever. And those sorts of triggers, I think, ultimately it gets into what is human and what's not human. I think human is our intentionality, our relationships, who we care about and why. And then we want tech extensions. I'm fine with Neuralink, if you can do the thing. But I think what we have to be is we have to stand for something. Somebody I talked with about this said, ultimately, no matter what happens with the tech, you and I are human beings. We have to interact. We have to interact with our children and our partners and, our political, at the end of the day, I think all humans care about is meat space, so to speak. And so no matter how much we outsource tech, we still have integrity or we don't. We have goodwill or we don't. We're still morally responsible agents, no matter how much of the doing the thing. We're still the kind of wizard behind the machine, so to speak, even if the machine is doing so much more.
Yeah. I mean, two kind of synthesis thoughts here. One is that so much of what you're saying seems to be baked into the dynamism in the West. So the decision about the ultimate question, like, what is the good life, is for us in the West, ours to make, not anyone else's. And there are many traditions, the heroic tradition of Homer, the philosophic kind of contemplative one of Socrates, the life of pious devotion of Jesus, that don't necessarily commensurate, but present a really interesting, different view of what it means to live well. And all of us form, our picture based on synthesis of those traditions or inventing of a new one. And that's our question to decide. That's really important. That's how we secure consent. That's how the founders channeled Locke and how we set it up. The other thing that's really interesting is, and we can talk more about like some of the tutoring, with my children, but humans are really good at adapting the kind of knowledge we use in the world. And a long time ago, we definitely needed to know how to make bread, and there's like a sensory motor component of that. There's a recipe component, it isn't like 6 hours of speeches, but you have to remember the ingredients. I couldn't tell you how to make bread with the ingredients, right? That goes away for some of us. And then in the Google era, we had to adapt and use much more of our search brain. Of course, search had evolved for, finding berries or whatever, but we use it now. Bread becomes a search, not a sensory motor or memory thing, right? And so the question is, what is the AI adaptation? And I'm confident we'll get there, but it's kind of nice to think in advance. And one of the things that I think we've been trying to work on is, how do you develop a relationship between you and a thing that could do the thinking for you? How do you have this epistemic relationship? So one of the really funny questions that Mike asked my daughter, Arden, was, he started it with, if daddy says one thing and mommy says another thing, like you ask him a question, they say, who's right? And he said dad. She said dad. So I was really excited about that. I was like, I did one of the Napoleon Dynamite, like, yes. But then he said, let's ask, what if it's dad saying one thing and then AI saying another thing. And almost before he finished the question, she's like, AI. Like, she's like, and then he threw her for a loop and he said, what if it's one AI? Because she knows there are kind of different ones. One AI and another AI. And she was like, huh. And she really was like, I don't know. So this whole process of developing it, the relationship is so powerful. I asked her later that week in the car, because I try to kind of build off of what we've been talking about. I asked her, I was like, Arden, it's a dangerous question. I was like, I don't know if I want to ask this one, but I was like, can AI be a friend? And because we've done this kind of tutoring, what used to be like a laughter thing, right? She would just be like, oh, she actually thinks about it, right? She takes a second. And she said, well, AI can do things that friends do. It can walk with you and it can talk with you. But she paused and she's like, but it doesn't really love you. And I just think this is a kind of like thing where you're developing a sort of relationship to it that's very early, but it requires some reflective, maybe like metacognition. It requires just recognizing that this is not you, you are you, and like building that relationship. Yeah.
Oh, two points. First, this sounds distant, but when you were talking about, baking bread, I find that, and I do talk to a lot of tech entrepreneurs about their kids, often I'm emphasizing things like baking bread and singing songs and, building tree houses and, being embedded in the world. And I think in a certain sense, as tech, whether it's AI or robotics, does all the things for us, we want to do more tactile, real world things. And I think it becomes very satisfying. The other thing is, Brendan and I both have done classes at St. John's College where it's Socratic seminars. In a circle, you read a book, you ask an open-ended question and discuss it. And I think one of the underappreciated things about that process is, I'll put in a kind of a threatening way, you never know who's going to ask you what. And so when I think of kind of replicating Socratic and AI, I think part of what gives it vibrancy is if you state an opinion, anybody could ask you a question. And so I think it doesn't feel like threat. You do it in a warm, friendly way. It's not necessary, but you still have to be alert. I think there's this alertness to, did I contradict myself? And I think the core of Socratic dialogue is consistency and coherence. So if I say something and whoops, I hadn't thought of that, and you ask me something, whoops, I hadn't thought of that. And so I think in our deep subconscious, hours, perhaps years of Socratic dialogue, creates this awareness of, am I taking consistent, coherent, defensible positions? And this even gets into the intellectual integrity on the one hand, and then ultimately in integrity in the real world. Could I be questioned about doing this and so forth? And I think that is where the moral stakes of being a human being are irreducibly human. And so however much, and I want AI to leverage us in so many ways. I like the beautiful vision of an AI future, but I think the moral stakes of being an embedded human being in the real world, we want to kind of double down on and find ways individually in community and schools and so forth to really become excellent at being a morally embedded human being.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, so this is a little bit wonky, but I think it's useful. So, Aristotle broke the virtues into the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues, but beneath those, I think there is a set of traits, dispositions, habits that make it more possible to attain the virtue. And one of the things you just said was a desire for coherence. And that's a really powerful thing. It's like, I would argue, the sad version of it is, I don't think everyone wants coherence. I just talked to somebody who's a philosophy teacher at a big public school in New York, and that was one of his critiques to me actually this weekend, was like, he said, I'll tell somebody something and they'll recognize they're wrong. It doesn't do anything to them. They're just like, oh yeah, okay. Whereas I think for a lot of us who are really like passionate knowers or seekers of knowledge, like for us, that would be hard. We'd have to sort of say, okay, let me take a step back. Right. Let me think about how this all fits in. So the Socratic format causes that. To that like epistemic virtue that sits beneath the intellectual virtue, it causes it to go up. And I think this is a great model for education, is like, how can we act on that layer and produce the right habits of mind, whether it's good questioning, good moral receptivity, good coherent searching. Yeah.
So a couple of things. Once I remember somebody remarking similar to what you said, only a philosopher could care if there was a contradiction. Realize that most people don't care. And by the way, I think the history of mathematics and philosophy have been intertwined because mathematicians also care about contradictions. So a certain kind of rational mind really cares about contradictions. But I think this is where I think there's a strong case, a million case, that we need social norms, and this is why social media that enforces or supports integrity is really important. But beyond that, I think a lot of people just live their lives. But, I'm interested in creating subcultures at schools where we do care about intellectual dialogue and contradiction and not contradicting ourselves. But I think the flip side of this is it does make education much more alive. Again, I don't want to emphasize the threat component too much, but if you are morally accountable in a discussion with your peers, it's not boring anymore. And a lot of school, I respect what Alpha's doing, but they're using external incentives. What's an internal incentive? Certainly when at puberty, it's who am I, what is my standing with my peers, and to be morally, and again, I think of a rite of passage with, kid at puberty in a village anywhere in the world, you're morally accountable to your peers in a certain sense. And so I think I would like to see a rite of passage at puberty be morally accountable for your opinions, both within your community, in your school, and ultimately in online spaces. And maybe, the slop version of AI is it's hopeless, but the optimistic version of these can be better.
I'll say a couple of things about that, and then I'd love to, get some other folks in here. So I think these will go together. But one of the things that I could have mentioned when you said, kind of like, what are you worried about, or the dangers, is Claude Boys. Has anyone heard of Claude Boys? Yeah. All right. So Claude Boys is this phenomenon. It happened last year. It was on social media, and the idea was these teenage boys, they live by the Claude and they die by the Claude. They're like self-proclaimed Claude boys who wake up in the morning and do what Claude tells them. From the morning they wake up, from the moment they wake up to the time they go to bed. And it started as kind of a joke, but then people really adopted this idea, and it's really seductive. And actually, I had just heard behind closed doors a bunch of really high level people in EA, effective altruist community, and at Anthropic that were like, if you're not doing this, you're being a rebel. Like, the reason is that there are really serious, I think, philosophical arguments for this kind of deference. And they mostly have to do with humans being really fallible, reasoners. We didn't evolve. We evolved to reason in tribes, that kind of thing. So I started to take this seriously. I was like, how do I put that in the best possible terms, like why you would want to defer, and how do I kind of understand why I think it misses something about what it means to be human? Anyway, so I looked at that question. The other thing it led me to, which ties to, I'm happy to talk more about that, but the other thing it led me to that ties to what you just said about being kind of accountable to your peers is, Adam Smith helped me realize how important it is in life to do moral formation at a very, excuse me, sorry about that. I need to get a little bit more water, but to be able to develop oneself with their family and with their peers and with their community in a way that then sets them up for participating in the broader, spontaneous social order. So one of the ways he articulates this is that we have this kind of idea, thank you, of an impartial spectator, where we imagine not just how do I feel, but also how might the impartial observer feel. And we form this kind of like perspective on ourselves through acting with others, right? We interact with them and we act together, and we form this. And it's kind of like a recursive social process where we're developing this, and we're developing our moral sense, our sympathies. And he says that this is the base on which we build outward. It's not that we can be sympathetic with all humans right away. It's that we learn to love our people, and then we can extend this outward. And so one of the things that I think is critical with education is to do the moral development, which has to be particular. It has to be, close in. It has to deal with like the details of those around you, so that we form our impartial spectators and then can carry that out as good citizens and market participants, that sort of thing.
Quick note, and then we will bring other people in. So I have heard of the Claude Boys. I think it's terrifying. I think at some point, might ask somebody to, there have been cases of AI suggesting people kill themselves and
Right.
could kill others and so forth. Give a different example. I know somebody who's working on a fairly sophisticated legal case and using GPT-5 as well as a high-powered lawyer. GPT-5 is pretty amazing. It summarizes a ton of legal information quickly and well. And I would never want to make a final decision based on the advice of the GPT. Again, human lawyers, even the very best human lawyers, the best human scientists, there is moral, intellectual disagreement among, the best of the best. And so I think ultimately, I think we should make the expectation that all humans are making human making human decisions. One other small point, because AI is so cheap and effective, a lot of people are kind of communicating using AI sometimes, and there is pushback against people communicating with each other in a faux interpersonal way using an AI voice. And I think that's a sign of it's healthy, that we don't want humans to be pretending to communicate with using AI. We want that human connection.
Yeah.
But Brendan and I can clearly go on for hours and hours and
Yes.
hours of a blast. So does anybody have a question or comment? You add to the mix?
I would say we'll utilize the mic like your wand, okay? If you're holding the wand, you get to speak. And I'd love for everyone to make sure that you share your name, and that way we get to know each other better.
Steve has something.
To the scary notion of the Claw Boys, I think one of the dangers is we anthropomorphize these tools because they speak to us like we speak to each other. But you wouldn't look to Google like the Claw Boys look to AI. You would know what you were looking for, and you would get a simple answer. With AI, you seem to get a sense-making scenario. And it seems one of the issues we have is that, so with the Claw Boys specifically, is maybe they don't realize how much bias is in these tools. As we say in the machine learning world, garbage in, garbage out. And these tools do possess a tremendous amount of bias. There are many experts who can disagree which ones are winning the day with the particular query you had. Any thoughts on how we might help these tools evolve to be less deterministic in that front and represent a breadth of views? Or at least recognize the fact that these tools are going to give you biased answers if they're not giving you a straight up hallucination, which is commonplace and I don't think leaves the large language model anytime soon.
You want to talk about truth-seeking AI and maybe the community?
Yeah, I can talk about that, but I also want to make the point that I don't think it matters whether the tool is biased or not. In this context of outsourcing, of deference, I think it matters whether, we seek to defer for convenience. There's something deeply psychological for this. And the reason I say this, it's not to say that bias doesn't matter. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm trying to say that, Tocqueville's concern about American democracy it echoes with this, right? It's we might outsource our thinking to the majority. We might outsource our thinking to the state. It wasn't that we needed to care whether the majority was right. Tocqueville wasn't actually really concerned about that. He was concerned that we cease to be self-directed citizens if we outsource all decisions to the mob, And so I think this is another point that there's one question of how well is AI suited to do moral reasoning or whatever. And you could run the thought experiment that's let's say AI is amazing at moral reasoning. I still don't think we should defer in this extensive way on moral questions, even if it's amazing. And so hopefully I make that point clear enough. But on the point of truth seeking, so we sort of saw that AI is mediating 20% of waking life on the planet for adults. It's a very big number. I'm not referring just to LLMs. I'm referring also to recommender systems. And we said, this is having a profound impact on the kind of information that reaches us, the thoughts that form in our mind, how we decide what's good for us. And so this is a really high stakes issue. I thought the people who care about free speech and truth seeking are by and large not in the game on how the recommender systems get built. So we formed a partnership with FIRE. You know FIRE well and support them, and they're the top, I think defenders of free speech, a bunch of constitutional lawyers. And we said, how could we take free speech principles and build them into the future of technology? And we looked at really two things. One is Mill's ideas. So the idea that humans are fallible, that on these complex issues, the one opinion rarely contains the whole truth. We need contestation. Contestation also opens up new avenues for exploration, all the things you're doing at Integrally. And that we need, not just dead dogma, but ideas that really take hold in our mind. So we looked at this idea from Mill of what it takes for an epistemic environment to be conducive to truth. The second thing we looked at is how do you make the humans in that environment better questioners? These are, in my mind, a little bit separate. Like Mill's sort of setting the social context for how we seek truth and describing that. But then the individual has to still care about coherence. They have to still be good questioners. And then we put $1 million to work on backing open source projects that advance that. And these are actual technical projects. These are prototypes. So we're working with people who are advancing community notes. There's a researcher at MIT who's got a great way to scale community notes. We're talking with the actual community notes team at X about this. We backed a reporter whose work is trying to look at how do you maintain the unique voice of the individual in writing. Because if we basically move to a world where we have 5 different writing tones, like one for Grok and one for Claude, that's not a great world. We need to have lots of the richness of the individual and the idiosyncrasy of individual thought persist. So we're backing a range of projects around that. We're just kind of getting started. We're going to do a symposium here in Austin. Jonathan Rauch, who wrote Constitutional Knowledge, is going to come. It's early December. And we think it's, the first project of its kind to really try to, put those two communities together to work on this.
Yeah, absolutely. To take a very different take, for a long time, I've thought we should educate young people on how to deal with disagreement and the fact that people disagree in the real world, which is banal for many of us. But there is an older model of education that's just, this is the authoritative, this is the history of the U.S. It's either this or this. I know a lot of educators who used to try to get kids to avoid Wikipedia and go to Encyclopedia Britannica. I always said, no, I like Wikipedia because you can go to the talk page. And I always say, Encyclopedia Britannica has a pretty good authoritative view of the world, but it's one authoritative view in the world. On any question, you can go to the Wikipedia talk page, and I'm sure on the Israel-Palestine question, there are probably 500 pages of debate, or maybe 10,000, I don't know. But you can kind of see where the edges are. And I think part of being human is not just being intentional and moral, but in a certain sense, we all need to become more sophisticated about epistemology. How do we know what we know? And so I think the young people of the future just have to become who to trust and who do I trust and why do I trust them? Who do I not trust and why do I trust them? And part of coherence is that person said that over there, that over there. Again, I don't want to be pitching integrally, but that's the problem you're trying to solve is, right, who is speaking with intellectual integrity and who is not. Yeah. Other questions?
You want to go? I mean, I can make one. I could talk all day. No, one thing I've been thinking about is the skepticism piece, where it's like we want to teach kids and adolescents to think skeptically about all these tools, to ask the right questions. And that really goes against the traditional models that are more authoritarian. So how do you see that transition happening now that we're at this kind of nexus?
So actually a really interesting piece, and I'm flavored because I was reading the blog or Substack of a young woman who kind of went through a life crisis, becoming too skeptical and now is less skeptical. She was very philosophical. But I actually find that, I have Socratic schools. I've done Socratic schools for decades where, one description of St. John's is you have your most sacred beliefs ripped to shreds week after week for 4 years. But one of the, I think, surprising things that happen is a few people become skeptics and nihilists, but I think actually most people develop deeper convictions about what they believe to be true and what matters. So if people are always challenging you, again, and it's a worthwhile danger at some point, they don't believe anything. But I think in many cases, no, this is what matters to me. I actually have a student who has, her family has one kind of culture and her social life has a very different kind of culture. She's living in the Bay Area and her family is more traditional. And she finds that she's becoming sharper about who she is and what she stands for because she has to push back on her family in some ways and push back against the wild tech dudes she's hanging out with on the other. And that's a way of kind of purification, trial by fire, where this is what I really am. But
I would say, I think we're pretty far away from like a problem of skepticism. In other words, like I think the tendencies are are elsewhere, and I think they're in two places. One is in obedience, and like a simple way to think about this, I don't think this is the only cause, but early America, we were like 80% self-employed. The free people in America, 80% self-employed. We were yeoman farmers and artisans. And Jefferson's America was like, this was a key part of like the virtue. You know, it was like the sufficient or, you know, these like character components that came with living on a farm. And now we are flipped, like we're much more a nation of employees. The Industrial Revolution put us into that context, led to great prosperity, but really made us much more a nation of employees. And so generation after generation, we spent, you know, significant time being kind of inside of hierarchy and that sort of thing. And I think that changes the character of the nation in some important way. And that's the state we find ourselves in with now a tool that tempts us to defer. So this is a worrisome kind of trend. That's one thing. And then the other is like the nihilistic tendency. Like Alan Bloom has a pretty good account of this that I basically buy. Alan Bloom was an educator at the University of Chicago, taught a lot of freshmen in the 80s. Same situation now. He essentially says, I won't do it justice, but he essentially says that we took kind of idea of toleration from Locke, that we should respect, you know, all values in a way. Of course, Locke has a pretty subtle view on this, but we took that to a radical extreme and combined it with the influence of Nietzsche in a kind of like institutional rejection, and ended up with a unique blend of American nihilism that involves us believing in very little, like in sort of not being able to kind of even posit that something is good in any kind of you know, broader sense, I guess. And so I think like that's different from skepticism. Like nihilism and believing in nothing is different from the skeptic, which is a very active kind of probing around that. I think you'll see that at the edge, like people who dive too deep, too quickly into philosophy or whatever, and lose track of where their attention might be and like the salience of which questions, right? You can't ask yourself all questions at once, sort of deal. But I see it basically being obedience and nihilism that are the more dominant forces. Yeah.
Just actually to do a narrow thing, because much of our Socratic discussions focus on textual analysis, which may sound, you know, banal and distant to these questions. Many, in the case of poetry, most students are taught, oh, poems mean whatever you want them to mean. And so to kind of push away from that radical relativism, I often say, is this poem a recipe for chicken soup? No, it's not a recipe for chicken soup. Okay, so what does it mean? And kind of getting to the point of judgment, going back to phronesis. Yeah. I think something that's missing in the modern world is, yes, we disagree and there's uncertainty, and there is meaning and truth. And so how to train more young people to kind of integrate those perspectives.
Yeah.
I'm going to let Joe go first.
I have a question. So mine's on the art of the possible and mental health in AI, especially in young people. I work with MIT Media Labs on their Future You project, where it's actually we're making a movie about it, but it's pretty exciting where they're using AI. What started off as students now might be applied to elderly, which is interesting. You made it through the semester, so you put in some inputs about yourself, and then it shows you 6 months later, and it's like, you passed the test, you made friends, like, you know, you got that internship. So it's almost like cheering you on. It's like that visualization exercise, I think, right? It's like, what do you want to be? And so I'd love to know your thoughts on AI and visualization and mental health and maybe some positives there.
Well, actually, I'm going to talk about a very specific project. I teach a purpose class 5 days a week based on 30 minutes a day based on the Ikigai diagram. What do you love? What are you good at? What does the world need? What will the world pay for? And we discuss that. And I've had a tech entrepreneur interested in doing an AI version of this. And a couple things. One is we'll integrate this dialogue where instead of telling them what they should be, let's think about what do you love in terms of what do you love versus what your peer pressure or social media or your younger self. That is, who is the I that's really making this decision? What are you good at? Competence is really important, and so forth and so on. And the idea is to combine an AI that sets this up, avatars that may discuss this, but then human community and human mentors, because I think the human side is really important. And it would take us off track to go too much. But there is sort of a strand of criticism of some parts of therapeutic culture, which is simply validating. I think one of the tricky things in our society, whether it's AI or schools or therapeutic culture, is part of being a moral being is both being compassionate, empathetic, and holding each other accountable. And so I'm a little bit concerned about kind of the flattery AI, including the flattery AI and the mental health component. But I'll let you.
I think it's really interesting. My wife's a mental health counselor. Right when I found philosophy, she found that. She was in the kind of corporate world prior to that. And so we talk about these things a lot. One thing that I remember from the Sober documentary, which is amazing, and I know you worked on it, it's about the Phoenix and about people who rise from the ashes from addiction in LA and around the country and around the world. But one of the things it said is that these people didn't dream. They didn't have any dreams because, like, the way I interpret it is, Maslow, I think, characterizes this really well, which is if you have like huge concern for your security, for your like basic bodily needs, you focus like all of your resources towards that. It's sort of everything comes inward. It's narrow. You see only the foreground and like inside. And then as you obtain levels of comfort, you can then start, and only then, to kind of think about the broader. And at some point, sort of at the top of this, you become able to think about, to point beyond yourself and think about the community. And that's deeply fulfilling, that sort of thing. Anyway, and so why I like this kind of diachronic tool, if you will, is like, because it could be a kind of intervention if somebody has never really like developed the capacity to dream. Like, I think of somebody who's been in poverty for most of their life. I think it can be like anything, something that you probably would need a version of like integration to deal with. Like, if somebody's never dreamed for themselves, I can see them like breaking down or being confused or being like mad, because they're like, I can never do that. So I think it's not something to be taken lightly, if you will, especially with more vulnerable populations. But the idea that AI can be used to intervene, to kind of like allow somebody to see the next rung on that sort of like, aspirational trajectory is, I think, a really cool, really cool concept.
It's hard to follow a question after a question because now I'm off down this. Thanks for that question, Joe. And Brendan, I actually want to build on that concept of dreaming. So there are two topics that are deeply personal to me in this moment related to AI and human flourishing. One concern I have is around the impact on entrepreneurship and innovation. You spoke about the basis of this country being built by builders, and you were hoping to coach philosophical builders. From what I have seen in teaching entrepreneurship at the university level for the last 3 years, going on 5 if I count others, my students have become so lazy and they're turning in slop. And they aren't double checking their work. And there is such a lack of imagination and innovation that they're just putting in rote responses guided by Claude or guided by ChatGPT. And I'm scared for the impact on entrepreneurship and innovation. And as regulatory environments, my God, I'm throwing this to you, make building businesses harder, and then we take away the human ingenuity and the innovation that comes through hardship to some extent, I'm worried about the impact of all of these tools making life easier. How is this going to impact us as a nation? How is this going to impact innovation? And my other question will be related to national security, but let's dig into this a little first.
So first, I would say K-12 is broken far more than people believe, and universities are broken far more than people believe. Again, because I have a school where kids are entrepreneurial, creative, and intellectual, I've got teenagers who are doing serious entrepreneurial projects. And a lot of this is you raise them to have initiative. John Taylor Gatto, New York State Teacher of the Year, described conventional education as 13 years of training in how to be passive and dependent. And I think people 30 years ago when he wrote that thought it was perhaps hyperbole. But now when we see with GPT, there's an epidemic of cheating on high school and college essays. But I think, again, the winners will be those young people who will go out and take initiative and do things. And there will be young people, and maybe many of them will be immigrants and very pro-immigrant for this respect. But there will also be, hungry, young, motivated people. And gradually, I think parents and others will see, I can't let my child be passive. It goes down to being agentic, whether it's intellectual agency or, get stuff done in agency. I think agency in human development has become a greater priority than ever before.
Yeah, I'll just say that Michael said something to me once that ultimately made me decide to send my kids to a private school. I had moved to a very good public school, Eanes, district in Westlake in Austin, and I had gone to public school, sort of. I went to a place called TJ. People always make fun of me when I say it's public school because we had a supercomputer and stuff like that. But it was, my mom taught at public school for 36 years, taught special needs kids, and so like any parent, you kind of like, you're colored by your experience. But what Michael said was that the light in your kid's eyes can go out. It can dim and it can go out. And when it does, it's extremely hard to get it back. And I started to think about that, and I really then tried to orient my educational choices around that. It's like, how do I ensure that the light never goes out, that it grows and, smolders, if you will. And I thought, that the private school model in particular, one that is all about active, engagement with technology and with the world is going to be the way to do it. I think there's a word for this in Plato and other places, but eros, like it's a kind of like divine madness, if you will, that like leads us to the desire to know. Socrates calls it divine madness, but it's like the desire to know. Or you could think of it in some cases, like I think Carl Jung talks about a life force, but you just know that there's like this intensity that people have, like they really want to know, they really want to live. They're just like there with you in real measure. And this is what I get at like the light going out. So I think it's very much related that when the light goes out, we become, passive, and it can go out through, what Gatto, pinpointed, the kind of current system, public school system, or it can go out through a kind of soft dehumanization, which is using technology in this kind of very passive mode. I think about like if you had talked to the people who were on Soma in Brave New World, you would have seen something kind of similar. They would have been like approximately pleasant, like they were kind of enjoying the convenience that Soma, presented to them, but there would be something like dead inside about them. And so early education is like easily, I think, the best intervention. And then I'm working on a book that is about this idea of our, capacity for self-direction. And I don't know whether that'll make a dent, but like there is a kind of raising of awareness that like now is the time more than any point in history to, I think, like ensure that we remain human in that key respect. Yeah.
I won't spin out on Space Force and national security. I'll pass the mic to anyone else. Gonzalo?
This is a good idea. I'm trying to organize my question or my thoughts. But I think, how much would you say, Brendan, that your quest is, that the main key here is to, what you were worried about is autocomplete for meaning in life? Basically, are you worried, what you're worried that AI will do, or that we should all be worried that there will be more Claude boys that would say, how I find meaning in life has to go through these AI models or LLMs? I mean, is that sort of one of the key aspects of it? Because I think the search for meaning is one of the most, I mean, the thing that distinguishes us more than anyone else, than any other species in the world, that we're creatures in pursuit of that meaning and existential agency, to call it like we try to discuss it with Clay and at Archbridge. The idea is that I think that's the most powerful thing that motivates us. So there's a lot of the AIs and LLMs, in my opinion, or there's definitely a lot of the dangers that you mentioned, but I see it for now as more worried about the knowledge and the mind, and how do we amplify a lot of our knowledge to build things, to do more things. But that soul-seeking element of it is not threatened yet, although that Claude Boy's example that I also learned from you from reading your Substack, it's scary for sure. But in relating it to the Maslow, the Maslow comment is, I certainly agree with that, and I wasn't, I suppose, never as poor as others, but being raised or living in other developing countries, I understand that sort of, you have to meet some of those things of immediate poverty, solve that. But I think even even then, an example of maybe Maslow meets Viktor Frankl, that even in a concentration camp, when you have deprivation, imagine also from eating or being able to survive, there's that sense of meaning or pursuit of something bigger, of dreaming, like you had in the other example, that sort of drives us as much as anything else. And I see that being for sure threatened by all these elements. But I think that's one of the key questions with agency and meaning in that sense.
Yeah, I think like the way I kind of think about it is if part of the project, I say the project, like being human, that project is to like discover and develop our gifts, to use those gifts to like live the life we aspire to live, and do that in a community with others, and do it in a way that is meaningful. I think we do it kind of through a lot of trial and error, a lot of development. Like, I think we have some innate potentialities and some dispositions. Like, I think some parts of our journey are, we have a good starting point for them, right? I don't think we're just sort of like a clean slate. I think we have some starting point, but so much of how we then develop, how we grow like a tree is through trying things in the world, right? And like making decisions. Some of those are decisions we're deeply deliberating on. Some of those are just like totally like unthinking, just like we're just kind of trial and error learners. We tried something and we failed. Mm-hmm. But through this process and with the right reflection, we are kind of discovering a lot about ourselves. And the more freedom we have and the more encounter we have with a wide variety of situations. One of the reasons that I really cherish that I spent 610 days underwater on a submarine and did, and now, do philosophy teaching at Oxford is because it's like many different lives in one, right? And I think that's really cool, is like to the extent you can, resist the possibility of living just one life. I think this process is better, and it's really cool. But all this is to say that I agree with you, but I think that AI can act on the self-direction part that forms the kind of like everyday decision. And when it does that, we don't even do the development. We don't even discover and develop. And the meaning that we might have is not even disclosed to us. Like we sort of become this, we don't grow like the tree. And so rather than thinking about it as like AI is somehow going to tell us what that ultimate thing is, I think AI, if we seed decision making and if it atrophies and if we don't self-direct, then all the steps that we needed to do to get there will be kind of affected, and we'll just never know what was possible. Yeah.
I'm going to add a little bit. So, the Greeks like to say, count no man happy until he's dead. And part of that is, of course, bad things can happen to you, or you can be very successful and fall. But also, I think, what does one's life mean as a whole? And if you think of that, if your goal is to have a meaningful life, then part of it, I think, is, in some sense, adding value to the world. And there are lots and lots and lots of different ways to add value in the world. But I think if one is intentional about wanting to be valuable to the world in some sense from a young age, one is more likely to get there. And this even goes to, I think, sometimes people who are mentally not well, is they don't know how to add value, or they're not capable in many ways. And so you can help them be valuable. There's nothing like other people carrying, valuing you for what you did. And so one other thing I like to do in my school is I like to have young people write an autobiography from the age of 100. And the idea is, what would people say about you, to get them forward focused on what their life means. Tim Urban, Wait But Why, has a chart of your life in weeks, and we have a remarkably limited number of weeks. And you think about, I blew that Saturday. Okay, I've only got so many left. So I like to have this framework. And, AI hedonism or any kind of hedonism will never get us to a meaningful life. So regardless of belief system, let's do something that matters and that people value.
Hey everybody, John Purcell with Stand Together here. Love what you guys are saying. I'm kind of curious what sort of the permissionless innovation side of things and then the pessimistic side of things, where you guys feel hopeful. I'm usually in DC a lot, and I've heard the pessimist side where it's like, we'll all just end up kind of as like meat puppets, where we were a video camera, someone films you and they're like, oh, this person acted that way. Here's how you respond to your emails. Here's how you do this. I mean, I guess what would you say to folks who are super pessimistic and have that, the anthropic type future versus the optimistic future? What makes you guys hopeful right now?
Well, I'll do the education hopeful, and you can. I don't know if you want to be the AI hopeful, but as a libertarian, educational scholarship accounts more than half already with legislation passed. More than half the young people in the U.S. have an opportunity for educational choice. Home run, because I think when parents can choose, parents will choose educational options that will develop virtue and meaning and purpose in young people. So I'm very critical of trad education for meaninglessness and purposelessness, and we can have the dystopian with AI just appealing to our most base desires and so forth, or we can have a market. I actually call school choice market in happiness and well-being. So we legalized gambling, pornography, and drugs, but made kind of it illegal to have happiness and well-being for our children. Now we're legalizing happiness and well-being so the next generation can flourish. Maybe a little bit of hyperbole there, but you're probably sympathetic to the general. Go ahead.
I mean, I think the anthropic comment is interesting because I know one of the co-founders really well, and he and I actually think kind of alike on this, but I get that their public branding is a little more gloom and doom. But they have a bunch of, let's just say they have a bunch of different thinkers inside that don't all agree with one another. But I mean, I think a way to frame the positive case is one of the ways to think about the reason that the past looks so benighted compared to the present is that, and what I mean by that is we have much longer lifespan, we have much more wealth, we have near unlimited access to creative works, we have the ability to cure diseases that plagued, our ancestors, all the rest of these things, is we found a way to increase the use of knowledge in society, grow the use of knowledge in society, and this marriage of liberalism and science really produced a miracle in that respect. I think the use of knowledge, or the sort of stock of knowledge, if we can talk about it that way, stands to grow. I think there are ways in which it could be, that might not be true, but I think AI could be easily the most transformative force in that regard. Pushing ahead not only in science, but in the kind of more mundane areas where we grow knowledge through kind of experimenting and pursuing goals and, change circumstances, that kind of more mundane growth of knowledge. So one is the growth of knowledge. The other is that I think we've never really had an educational technology that can kind of talk back and help us improve. So one of the reasons that Plato and the Phaedrus critiqued writing is that you write it down and it can't talk back to you, right? And that was he viewed that as a symptom or a part of the cognitive atrophy that he feared. Well, now you can, right? And if it talks back to you with sycophancy or whatever, that's not especially helpful. But the kind of stuff that that Steve is building, the kind of stuff we're building at our AI lab at Oxford, those kinds of things, they're incredible. It's this is really a kind of flight simulator for thought. It really could produce much better thinkers, on that front. So you have more knowledge, you're better at thinking. And then the other part is that educational quality is really not well distributed. For example, the best kind of education, those sort of liberal education in my mind, the St. John's thing, not distributed at all. Liberal education is still really, really limited to the few. And I don't see why AI can't be kind of a weapon of mass education in a way, where it can bring this out. I mean, aristocratic tutoring and these kinds of great methods, they don't scale. But AI can do things that distill the best of that, and certainly innovative school models that take advantage of what AI can do alongside the kind of cultural components, et cetera, are really, really promising. So lots more knowledge, better thinkers, and a kind of scaling of virtue cultures and of educational opportunities. That's a pretty bright future.
So I have a very specific, immediately relevant case where I don't think AI on its own will get us the knowledge, and if you can find a way, be delighted. But the core proposal of the Adolescent Flourishing Initiative, and I've talked to Stand Together, happy to talk to more people, is we are looking for research to see if micro schools, private schools, homeschooling does improve educational mental well-being, character and wellness outcomes. Suppose, hypothetically, and I think it's plausible, suppose homeschoolers and micro schools were 50% less likely to commit suicide. Wow. What parent would leave their kid in regular school if you could reduce the risk of suicide that much? That said, that information, very high, and it's distributed across millions of homes in these little tiny micro schools. Maybe Alpha is probably one of those 50% less, but until and unless we have a mechanism to get that information, I don't see there's any way AI on its own could get that. So we'll still need meat space initiatives like this to extract certain kinds of information.
I do think this is a good area for I don't know if randomized control trials is the right word, but the way of thinking about kind of the measurement components of this, because I think that these educational models are so promising and interesting, but until you kind of run the tests like that, it's going to be hard to convince everyone that needs to be convinced. And when you do, it should be pretty easy. So somebody kind of backing a really interesting measurement approach that has enough distance from kind of political capture, let's say. I think it would be hard if there was a significant partisan leaning around the measurement, because it would become contentious. But I suspect that's a high priority area.
Just briefly on that, of course, in school choice, self-selection will be such a huge thing, hard to do. That said, there have been things where, and you may know more than I do about this, where there's kind of a phased-in introduction, and because when the introduction was phased in, it kind of replicates a bit of a randomized control trial. Can you see, was there a difference from date A to date B, and then can we attribute that to the policy change? So there is research along those lines. And then with charter school lottery approaches are basically randomized. So there's quasi versions of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned it like a discontinuity study. I come from healthcare, so does Jocelyn, and so we think about how do you get these measures if a randomized controlled trial is not possible? Self-selection bias and the like. Any more thoughts on what other measures or markers of non-cognitive benefits, other surrogate markers that might indicate progress on that?
Well, it's not the same, but one interesting one is criminality. So there's both a matching on socioeconomic, which is not as good, but there was randomized lottery into a charter school, and based on that, the children who won the randomized lottery into the charter school had significantly less criminality than those that did not. And again, if we could show that private or charter schools reduce criminality by 20%, 30%, whatever, wow. Lots of little pieces. One of the reasons I want to do the adolescent flourishing pieces is they're kind of thin, tiny bits and pieces of evidence, but it's scattered. And because all academic education departments are on the left, pro-public school, somebody was telling me that even at Baylor, a Christian private university in Texas, almost all the education professors are pro-public school. Walton Foundation financed a thing at the University of Arkansas, which is the only pro-school choice education unit in the US, probably in the world. And so when you have such monolithic academic bias, then there is certain kinds of information that are strictly invisible because it passes through this filter of, you get it.
One thing that's interesting is I think there are aspects of virtue that can be measured. And I say this hesitantly because I think that to measure human flourishing trivializes it and risks a kind of inevitable challenge of then optimizing for that metric, what we call good-hearting it, Goodhart's law. But hear me out though. So if we agree that asking good questions, or even kind of coherence findings, since we talk a lot about that, if we agree that that's an input into that, it helps us attain that intellectual virtue, which is part of what it means to flourish. Could we measure it there? And my suspicion is, imagine you have students who spend a year, really trying to train up their ability to ask questions. Maybe they're using your software, maybe they're doing something else, but they're asking questions and they're doing it in some way that's producing lots of measurements about this, right? I happen to believe AI is an incredible interface into the topology of questions. Like around any question you ask, you really have created, opened up a constellation of other questions. And that's so much of what Socratic dialogue feels out, is like kind of where are you in that complex? Well, let's imagine that AI helps provide that interface, that we go in and use it. It's hard for me to believe that if you worked with that tool for a year, you wouldn't become a better questioner. And it's also hard for me to believe that that couldn't be measured, that progress couldn't be measured. And if you can do that, now you've got a way to start producing, this diagnostics on a really key dimension we've recognized for millennia as important. And that's the kind of what I'm calling epistemic virtue here. So I think that's a neat area. I kind of like this area because, and this is a little bit of a soapbox, statement, but philosophy and AI, where they have integrated most deeply, is in the very, very mathy forms of philosophy. In other words, there's part of philosophy, utilitarianism, that posits, especially in its radical forms, that moral questions can basically be reduced to a single currency, and then you can try to optimize, you can try to maximize hedons or something like that, and measure things in utils and that sort of thing. And it is elegant mathematically, and it's seductive for those of us who are familiar with manipulating the world with symbols. But it isn't necessarily the case, and in fact obviates in my mind some questions that are really endemic to moral choice. That we often make these sharply heterogeneous trades, like courageous self-sacrifice in war and like saving your kid versus, malaria things. That's a bad example because those don't really come into conflict. But the point is, like, we can't represent them this way in my mind. The point there, though, is the AI community has glommed on to these really mathy parts of philosophy. And then the stuff Michael's talking about, which has to do with virtue and things like that, it's not very mathy. And it's a hard time doing it. But that doesn't mean it isn't essential. And so I kind of want to push the limit and explore there, while acknowledging that whenever you do a metric, you really do have that risk of trivializing or misdirecting yourself.
No, for sure. And just flourishing is a super active area of research. There's a number of universities. Actually, the Templeton Foundation, McGutt's on the board of the Templeton Foundation, is probably the leading funder. They put millions, probably tens of millions, into flourishing research. But there's something at Harvard, I think it's called the Harvard Flourishing Initiative. Tyler Vanderveel, scholar that leads it. They are doing a global research on flourishing. And a lot of it is survey, which is limited and so forth. But to lean into the kind of positive AI thing, something I'm very interested in is things like sentiment analysis. At scale, you can understand all sorts of how people are feeling. And then, sadly, I mentioned suicide not to oppress people, but it's unambiguous, or relatively unambiguous. So you can imagine all sorts of, and by the way, there's evidence that religion is protective against suicide, and B, that the woke mind virus is harmful to mental health, including suicide. And horrible thing to speculate, but you can imagine sentiment analysis at scale that looks at, these people are engaged in a certain religious conversation. These people are engaged in a world is horrible, evil, racist, sexist place. And what are the outcomes over time? Again, that's a really grim version, but hard metrics of a new kind may come to be because of AI at scale.
Michelle or Annie?
Okay. I guess it is. I don't know that I really have any questions. I've been enjoying this a lot because in our household, my husband is pro AI, so much so that on the dog walk yesterday, I was like, no more talk about AI. I can't take any more. I'm sort of in between and trying to figure out how do I use it for my life and make things easier. I work in a lot of healthcare world stuff, and it would be so awesome if I understood actually how to use these tools to actually analyze all this information because there's so much out there. And then my 15-year-old hates AI, thinks it's the worst thing ever and lectures us constantly about how we should not be using it. She reads Plato, she reads philosophy. She's a trip. But so I'm just enjoying this because I feel like I'm living it in different ways, and to hear y'all kind of talk about this and pontificate and think about these things, that's all I really have to say. I've just kind of been enjoying listening.
Well, after having been grim, to hear that your 15-year-old reads Plato and hates AI on his trip, like, all right, go mom.
Michael, you're going to love her daughter.
Obviously.
And she's anti-woke, so you'll be
There we go. Very cool.
Kind of in a similar vein, I work with independent musicians and do business management for them, and AI has entered their lives for sure, in so much as, we'll be like, okay, we need to come up with a marketing plan for this upcoming show that you're going to do. And someone that I work with, he's like, all right, let me ask ChatGPT what my marketing plan should be. And I was like, well, let's think of some strategies first. And he said, no, don't waste your time on that. And then he prints out what ChatGPT told him and hands it over to me. And he's like, there's the marketing plan. Now we just have to do it. And then I look at it and I start, that says, oh, reach out to this publication that has a similar theme as your show. And I type it into Google to try to find the publication, and that doesn't exist. And so it's really interesting to me to see an adult human being just take something for granted and be like, oh, it's done. This is the right answer, and it knows better than me. And not do the second step that you're talking about of the human then reviewing what the AI has created and making a decision for themselves. So I've really enjoyed it.
Me
but,
too,
yeah.
and I'll let you go forward. Is I think increasingly the valuable people to hire will have good judgment about when to use AI and not. And so I would not hire that person because clearly you don't have good judgment about when to use AI and when not. Go ahead.
No, I like that. It's related to my point. One of the things that Mill says on Liberty is that, like, kind of the magic of human reason is that we are able to make errors that are then corrigible. Like, we're basically able to make errors and then through reason kind of discover that they are such. And it's really cool because you think about a lot of these truth-seeking systems, you think about democracy, you think about many of the systems that really work well as being error correcting in a fundamental sense. And so then when I hear that, I'm like, my mind goes to that. It's like, how do we preserve the ability to try things and be like kind of silly with AI, like he's, just being kind of silly, but then have the means of error correction? And where I really get worried is if we atrophy our judgment, like if we, through doing that again and again and again and again in all walks of life, actually start to lose the muscle. Just like, if you don't set foot in a gym for a year, you're probably losing that muscle. Like we lose that kind of muscle that is judgment and deliberation. And then we kind of have lost, in some sense, the ability to even correct and to even like see the path forward. And I don't know if that resonates with you, but I think because in some sense I want to be I want to be kind that we have a totally new technology now. You say it's continuous, and it is in some respects, but we have this pretty wild thing, and none of us know exactly how to use it. We're going to make mistakes,
right?
But as long as we can error correct, this is okay. If we atrophy the mechanism, then we're in a different territory.
I want to make sort of an esoteric connection. So there's a lot of controversy about left brain, right brain hemisphericity, but I think there is certainly something to it. And even going back to lizards and birds, there's some differentiation between left brain and right brain. And the version that I find most interesting is, and why would lizards and birds have left brain, right brain specialization? And kind of it is, one part of the brain is focused on how to get the food, how to do the thing, and the other is checking the ambient world. And you imagine, you need to catch the food, but you also don't want to be killed by the thing. And so one part of the brain is focused on how do I get the thing, and the other is what's going on. And I think that AI is really good at getting the thing, but in terms of what's the bigger picture, not so good. And I knew somebody who did, algorithmic trading on Wall Street, and he said they always wanted the humans to check, because part of it is, what kind of things could affect an investment. There are, at any given time, probably millions of pieces of news, and a human might know, oh, that is going to impact that, have this huge, big picture, holistic perspective, whereas the focus is useful and necessary, and man, AI can get certain kinds of things done, faster than we ever could. So I think the human is in the relationship and the embeddedness and the moral integrity and things. And I think, well, if we know what to search for, AI can do it better. I think there's a way in which the human, ultimately this is, what is meaning and purpose, and how does it situate?
Michael and Brendan, I'd love it to give everyone a chance to, engage with you. I'm sure everyone has lots of thoughts and questions, but any last thoughts before we wrap up and kind of let everyone get another drink?
I think the something that if each of us takes seriously can spread, through our communities, our families, and so forth, is just the idea that however much we are tempted now to offload, to defer, to have this technology be used as autocomplete for life, for the small things up to and including the high things of meaning and so forth, however much we're tempted now, that I think will pale in comparison to the future. And the technology is getting better and better. And so now is a critical window to make choices and do it while we still remember what it means to choose. Like to make choices about, what it means to be human in this age, which sounds lofty, but I mean it I'm very practically and very urgently, is just to really try to set the habits of self-directedness and reflection that Michael and I have talked about prior to the temptation becoming, almost insurmountable for those of us who have cultivated the passivity and dependence with today's tools.
Honestly, one of the reasons I was delighted that Brendan created Cosmos is one framing of that was that on the one hand, we've got the AI accelerationists, let's go fast, it's going to solve all the world's problems, yeah. And then the other, the doomers, oh no, we're all going to die, and so forth. And in between that, nobody's talking about wisdom and virtue and how to live a better life. And, that's everything, is how do we live a better life? So done right, we could have incredible lives. Done wrong, we could have miserable lives, but I think it matters how we humans interact as humans, how human institutions are recreated. And if we think it's all just a tech game, and it's either doom or paradise through AI, we're missing the whole ball game. And so, I am very critical of universities because I love the humanities, and I think academic humanities has mostly destroyed the humanities. But at the same time, philosophy, wisdom, virtue are more important than ever before. So yeah, I think everyone here cares passionately about these. I think all of us are eager to engage in various ways. So if anybody wants to engage, let's wisdom and virtue and well-being win.
Thank you.
My name is Gonzalo Schwartz. I'm the president and CEO of the Archbridge Institute. We're an independent think tank working to lift barriers to human flourishing. We work at the intersection of the economic, psychology, and culture of human flourishing, trying to identify and remove the barriers that constrain people's potential and trying to help them climb the income ladder and achieve their American dreams. What I'm looking forward to tonight are the interesting conversations we're going to have about the intersection of online life, technology, how can people flourish in those environments. We usually hear a lot of pessimistic and negative narratives around what happens online, how do people engage in social media, in learning online. And what I'm trying to understand tonight or get more information about from different people's perspective is around how we can flourish online through more positive, some interactions.
I'm Steve Everist, founder and CEO of Integrally.one. We are a dialogic sense-making platform for the deep investigation of the truth value of claims. What differentiates our platform from a typical chat platform is you must gain a reputation through achieving the integrous esteem of your ideological opponents, as well as being able to persuade them towards your view of claims. We think our tool can have application in the education field. Students are needing to learn critical thinking skills these days, and with the narcissistic chat that they experience on social media platforms, we feel they're being highly misdirected from that purpose. We hope to help students learn how to engage their opponents with integrity, with good faith counter arguments, by demonstrating the ability to empathize with their arguments without sympathizing. That is the critical skill we think is missing today, and we think we can help children achieve more of that. At Integrally, we use AI in an interesting way. TAG, our AI system, is there to facilitate dialogue on the platform. It's there to help you find references to support your views on claims, but it's not there to write your argument for you. With Integrally, you're forced to do that, as we believe that wording your argument well is a critical thinking skill that should not be offloaded to AI. TAG is also there to counter every argument you make in favor of a claim or against a claim. TAG will take the opposite view. TAG does this to help steelman the counters that you will encounter inevitably, so you can always argue with TAG on our platform and build your critical thinking skills that way. However, the point is to engage your classmates, your peers, in the seeking of truth value of claims on the platform. That's best achieved by engaging your opponent. So TAG's there to also deliver arguments that are against your point of view, not just from TAG, but from others, so that you're forced to engage the best counter arguments to your viewpoints, and in the process, hopefully improve those viewpoints. It's not about winning the argument on Integrally, it's about developing a deeper understanding of the truth value of those claims. An example might be an argument that starts very polarized, with half the audience pro, half the audience strongly against a given claim. If at the end of that argument everyone ends up neutral on that claim, that would be a success story, I would believe, for Integrally. At that point, we can all agree that we don't know, or as Socrates said, develop the wisdom to understand that we don't understand anything, essentially, which is the nature of wisdom. To keep that open mind, that's the point of Integrally, and to investigate your own foundations, the foundations of your own beliefs. As we've heard from Brendan McCord often, his concern, and we share it at Integrally, is that AI will become autocomplete for life, autocomplete for your own thoughts. I think we'll hear about the Claude boys. It's a phenomena. Young men are referring to Claude to answer all of their questions about life, and they follow Claude's advice. It can be called that. And I think there's a failure to recognize in these large language models that they're only as good as their pre-training, and garbage in, garbage out, as we say in the machine learning world. And AI needs to be engaged with a sense of disbelief, with a sense that what you're hearing may not be true, and develop a better line of argument that AI might be giving you. I think that's one way we all need to be approaching AI, so that we don't find ourselves in the groupthink that it could encourage if we're not challenging what we hear from these so-called expert systems. And we're also in this age of social media echo chambers. And these echo chambers are places we naturally gravitate to. And if we're not choosing to find people we already agree with, the algorithm will tend to do that for us. This echo chambering is isolating us so much today that we're developing different languages, a sort of Tower of Babel problem, where we lose common ground. And we believe at Integrally that's common ground is only achieved when you engage those who believe differently, not your straw man of their beliefs, not their beliefs through somebody else's mouth, but from them directly. As Cicero said, and John Stuart Mill quoted, he who knows only his side of the argument knows little of that. And we believe that strongly at Integrally. As far as age groups we think will benefit from the tool, initially PhD level scholars who are investigating truth value of claims that will be well referenced by the empirical literature. But we think children are perfectly capable of this, and best to get to them early before they learn bad habits, before they learn low integrity strategies to try and win arguments with their opponents. So absolutely any age group we think could benefit. We hope to develop more critical thinkers in the population, those able to stand up to a popular narrative, help students in colleges learn how to not self-censor for fear of repercussions. Now that's a deeper problem. I think that's a cultural problem. But you can refine your arguments on integrity. We do de-identify you so that you can feel safe on integrity sharing your honest opinions. I think that's a critical feature of the tool. And so, yeah, I would argue that through the mechanisms we employ, that we give you that safe space to develop your own critical thoughts on the world, and hopefully build the confidence to take those thoughts to a more personal audience, a face-to-face audience, be more confident in your position.